welcome to today's awareness talk on FDA's Quality Management System Regulations Final Rule. I'm Aishwarya Varpe, your host for today. And before we begin the session, please ensure that your mics are on mute. Uh, if you have any questions during the session, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll address them during the Q&A session towards the end. Before we start, I'd like to introduce RIFC. RIFC is a joint initiative of Venture Center and BIRAC under BRBC program, where we aim to assist bio-entrepreneurs, medtech startups in planning, seeking, and securing of regulatory approvals in India, EU, and US markets. Where we also organize different activities like one-on-one mentoring sessions, our clinic, workshops, and venture-based camps. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Akash Dhade. He's an associate manager at RIFC Venture Center and has assisted multiple organizations in choosing regulatory pathways, creating technical documentations, and submitting documentations to the notified bodies for India, US, and European markets. He was involved in creating 510K summary documents for different device classes. He has experience in communicating and resolving queries for US FDA regulatory authorities. Akash has obtained the lead auditor certification for ISO 13485 quality management system from the BSI Academy. Without further delay, I'll hand it over to Akash to start his talk.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing good. As Aishwarya mentioned, I'm part of Venture Center RFC department, and today I take you through the QSR and the transition of FDA from QSR to QMSR. Now, QSR is Quality System Regulation, and QMSR is Quality Management System Regulation. To go further, just to take a look or just to introduce to you the regulation, the directive and guidance, we'll go through some of the definitions or the concept, what we call as what is regulation, what is the directive and guidance, and why we require this regulation, directive or guidance. Now, regulation is a rule which is set by the regulatory bodies for the compliance, for the quality and quality, safety and effectiveness of medical devices. So these regulations are compulsory to adhere to, and it is set, as I mentioned, it is set by the regulatory bodies. So in order to get the approval from them or to enter into their market, you have to adhere to this regulation. Similarly, there are directive and guidance documents. Now, directives and guidance documents, those are predominantly are in European market. Those are again set by the government bodies which look after the medical devices. But these directives or the guidances that are not compulsorily to be adhered to. These just provide us what exactly they want, but it's not mandatory to follow them. They can be also in form of explanatory documents. For example, FDA's guidance on classification, FDA's guidance on UDI system, right? So these guidance documents provide us more clarification on the concept given in the regulation or act or the law. Then why we require regulation, directive or guidance? Now these regulation, directive, guidance, those are directed towards ensuring the safety, basically, most importantly, safety and the effectiveness of medical devices. If you consider the medical devices usage, that those medical devices are used on human patients, or they interact with human patients and as well as other users. So to make sure that these medical devices are performing as intended and they are not harming the users of that medical device, we require regulation. They provide a framework by which the regulatory bodies can assess the manufacturer if the medical devices are produced and manufactured in a proper way or not. Okay, so that is the intention behind the regulation, directive or the guidance. Then there are major regulatory bodies across global market, and most important medical device market you can say is the US FDA or US medical device market. which is around 200 billions. So, and also apart from that, this US FDA market is also considered to be a benchmark for other global markets. So, if you consider from the manufacturer's point of view, if you enter into US market, you get a recognition across most of the major medical US markets across globe. For example, if you get US FDA clearance or US FDA approval, it's easier for you to enter into Canadian market, Japanese market, Australian market, Malaysian, Singapore, and European market. These are some of the major markets for medical devices. So if somebody wants to enter into these markets, it's very crucial for them to enter into US market as well. With this introduction, I would like to go to the QMS and ISO 13485 part. Now, why I'm talking about 21 CFR 820, you may be knowing it is a QSR which was earlier than QMSR, and the relevance to ISO 13485 because these QMSR are more aligned towards ISO 13485. It's very inherent to understand what all concepts were there in 21 CFR 820 and how it correlated to the ISO 13485. So here you can see there are different categories upon which the 21 CFR was based, and there were certain similarities and differences between 21 CFR 820 as well as ISO 13485. So the majorly ISO 13485 was mostly based on QMS or the risk-based approach. So if you can see here in the risk management part, in 21 CFR 820, it was not implied. It was implied but not explicitly emphasized. By that what it means is there were no emphasis on risk management, or they were not asking you to generate documentation which was clearly mentioning risk aspect of your device. Whereas in ISO 13485, all the clauses which were there, all the requirements from ISO 13485, those were directed towards risk management, and it was directed toward other QMS standard, which was ISO 14971, risk management for medical device product life cycle. So the basis of regulatory nature, it was 21 CFR 820 was legally binding by US federal regulation, whereas ISO 13485 was international voluntary standard. Even if it was voluntary standard by the international organization, however, major regulatory bodies across globe were requiring ISO 13485 as the basis of QMS evaluation. Okay, so if you consider EU, they have harmonized standard EN ISO 13485. If you ask for CDSCO, CDSCO also had requirement for QMS, and in order to go through the regulatory approval, you need to comply to ISO 13485 for CDSCO as well. Then, as I mentioned, the risk management basis or the emphasis on risk management was more in ISO 13485. That was the major difference between QMS, QSR, and ISO 13485. Going forward, there was software validation. The QMS software and automated process was required in QSR. So the documentation, if you are using any software in your QMS, that was required for QSR. But in ISO 13485, it was inherently asking to provide the validation of your software if your device was produced by using any of the software. So validation of any of the software which was involved in product lifecycle was mandatory by ISO 13485. Then part comes of document control and records. Now you may have heard terms like DHR, DMR, DHF, and MDF. These terms are kind of similar, but those terms were confusing in QSR, which was regulated by FDA. But if you go to ISO 13485, there was concept of medical device file. Now the content, if you compare from DHR, DMR, and DHF versus MDF, there were a lot of similarities. So even if you are complying to ISO 13485, if you want to go for 21 CFR Part 820 compliance, you need to generate different documents which were DHR, DMR, and DHF. Now this was duplication of work because many of the sections from medical device file were repeated in DHR, DMR, DHR. Okay, so people who are very well acquaintances with the concept like DHR, DMR, DHF, they may find the duplication in medical device file. Okay, so that was the difference between QSR and ISO 13485. Then the complaint handling procedure. So this was part of 21 CFR 820 mandatorily. Any medical devices that are going to be part of commercialization in US FDA, those are mandatorily asked for medical device reporting. Whether your device is class 1 device, class 2 or class 3, this MDR, the medical device reporting requirement was inbuilt part of QSR. Whereas in ISO 13485, it was not explicitly mentioned that you should have medical device reporting, but it was asking you to do market surveillance or continuous monitoring. So you may have SOPs for market surveillance, but medical device reporting is essential part of QSR. So that was major difference between QSR and ISO 13485. Then design controls. So this was major chunk. It was mandatory for class 2 and class 3 devices. Now these design controls were applicable for design inputs, design transfer, design output, and all the design related activities, whether it's verification and validation. But there was flexibility in ISO 13485 on how to do that or what all aspect of QMS you need to implement when it comes to design control. So that was the major difference between QSR and ISO 13485. Then supplier controls. So in QSR, there was more focus on supplier evaluation and purchasing control. But here in ISO 13485, it was more of a risk-based approach, wherein you should have a supplier quality agreement in place. You should have proper sections wherein you mention what all responsibilities are there on your part as a manufacturer and what all responsibilities are there for the suppliers. So the clear segregation was there between the responsibilities and ownership, and that was based on the risk which is associated with that supplier as well as the manufacturer controlled activities. So I have just taken you through some of the major changes or the differences between 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485. So because of these differences, some may found that even if they were complying with ISO 13485, there was duplication of work and there was redundancy. When you want to apply for 21 or when you want to comply with 21 CFR 820. So in order to reduce that burden or in order to merge or make the alignment between these two, the QMSR came into existence. So QMS, it transitioned from or QSR, it transitioned from QSR to quality management system regulation. So now there is an alignment between ISO 13485 QMS and the requirement from quality management system regulation. It was issued by FDA to replace 21 CFR Part 820. So the QSR, which was earlier there, is completely replaced by this QMSR. It was published in last February 2024 last year. So there is a timeline of 2 years by which it will came into the act. So by February 2026, any manufacturer who want to apply for US FDA approval or clearance, they need to comply with quality management system regulation, which is QMSR. So QSR is now obsolete and QMSR is in existence right now, and it will be there going forward. But why this transition? Why they are required to align with quality management system standards such as ISO 13485 or ISO 9000. So this need of QMSR was basically due to global harmonization. As I mentioned, there were differences between QSR and ISO 13485, as well as if somebody's already compliant with ISO 13485, they were not really in compliance with QSR, which made the entry into US market bit difficult. Okay, and also many of the other countries, they were accepting ISO 13485 as the basis of QMS. So to harmonize with global approach and also implement the risk-based approach in quality management system of the manufacturer, the US FDA thought of introducing QMSR. So it aligns US FDA's requirements with ISO 13485 and which many global markets already follow. Second was to reduce the redundancy. As I mentioned, you may have seen the concepts like DHF, DHR, and DMR, and there was duplication of same information in the medical device file. Similarly, there was a duplication of information in CAPA, corrective and preventive actions. There was duplication in medical device reporting, the continuous monitoring requirements. So to reduce the redundancy, to reduce the documentation burden on the manufacturer, and also to streamline the process for QMS evaluation, the FDA introduced the QMSR. So it avoid forcing manufacturer to maintain two separate systems. Okay, so if you know about MDSAP also is asked for QSR, not the ISO 13485. And the MDSAP countries such as Canada or Japan or other countries like Australia, they were also accepting ISO 13485. So manufacturer who is already compliant with MDSAP, they are required to maintain two QMS, such as QMS compliant with ISO 13485 and QMS compliant with QSR. So this was redundancy in a way. To reduce that, this QMSR came into existence. Similarly, if you reduce the burden on the documentation, it will reduce the timeline, it will reduce the efforts required, and as well as the cost required. So it was easier, or it becomes easier for any manufacturer who is already compliant with ISO 13485 to enter into US market. So that was the third major need, which made manufacturers entry easier into US market. So it's easier for non-US companies to enter US market and vice versa. So if the manufacturer who is already there in US, if there is they are compliant with QMSR, anyway they are going to comply with ISO 13485. So the manufacturers in US also gets easy entry for in other markets. That is why it was introduced as new QMSR. And the last one, modernization. Since this old QSR, it was drafted in 1996, which was almost 30 years back. And the technology evolvement was more. In these 30 years, there were many new concepts and also the new risks that were introduced, major recalls were there. So considering all these factors, the US FDA regulatory authorities thought to introduce or modernize their quality management system regulation, and that's why they have introduced the requirements which are very aligned with ISO 13485. Okay, I hope everybody is following till this point. Whatever questions you have, you may pose these questions in the group chat. Post this presentation, we will take some of these questions, and if not, we will connect separately. Okay. Going forward, now we are talking about this QMSR. What all sections are there? If you go to the final rule document of this QMSR, you will find these sections, section 1 to 11, which covers many aspects such as summary, background, legal authority, the comments. Now, if you see the structure of this QMSR, it's in the comments and responses form. What FDA did was they asked the responses or the comments on current QSR. There were many comments in this in different aspect of this QSR, and segregating these comments, FDA found out most relevant comments and provided response to those comments and provided this structure. So in the executive summary, there is purpose, summary of major provisions, what is the legal authority US FDA had, then cost and benefits. This is given in the summary format. Then abbreviations. There were commonly used terms which are used toward this rule. So the section 2 provides that commonly used terms such as the manufacturer, the repackagers, remanufacturer, rework. Some of these abbreviations are given in the second section. Then they have provided background, why the QMSR was needed, what is the current framework, what was the history, then comments on current current QSR, and then incorporation by reference. Now, please focus on this incorporation by reference. This incorporation by reference or IBR, it will come time and again when we discuss about QMSR. What it means by incorporation by reference is they have given reference of ISO 13485 2016 version as well as ISO 9001 2015 version. So when I say QMSR is more aligned with ISO 13485, they are saying that our QMSR is in alignment with ISO 13485 2016 version as well as the terms and definitions are more aligned with ISO 9000. Okay, so these two standards, ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9000 2015, are more relevant with ISO QMSR. So that's why this incorporation by reference, that's what incorporation by reference means. Then legal authority, that is just the administrative provision or the information provided by US FDA. Then section comes with comments US FDA responses. This is the major section wherein you will find what the major differences, the alignment with ISO 13485 and their clarification. How FDA thinks from the regulatory point of view, and if you are a manufacturer, what all things should be considered that are given in this section, such as what is the scope of it, what are the definitions, if there are any additional definitions, or if there are two definitions between the QMSR and ISO 13485 or 9000, which definition will supersede. Now, from the FDA's perspective, if there are two same definitions or if there are definitions of same terms in QSR or QMSR and ISO 13485, the definition which is given in the FDA regulation or FD&C Act, we take the precedence. Okay, so you have to consider definition given by FDA if there are two same terms between QMSR and ISO 13485. Then they have given the QMS requirements, which actually we are going to discuss in the further sections. Then in the clarification and amendments to current QSR, that is given in section 5. Then section 6 talks about effective date and implementation strategy. As I mentioned, this QMSR will be ineffective from February 2026. So they have given these transition details as well as how you can implement this QMSR into your current QMS. Okay. Then there are some requirements from the statutory bodies like economic impact, environmental impact. So this was not that this is not that relevant as of now if you are a manufacturer from outside US. So you don't have to consider much requirements from section 7 and 8. Then there is section 8, which talks about paperwork reduction. Now, this paperwork reduction is based on the 1995 Act. Now, this 1995 Act, which talks about paper reduction, says that there should be avoidance of redundancy in documentation. As I mentioned, the QMSR is more aligned with ISO 13485, so it will reduce the burden to create the documentation for separate QSR. So section 9 talks how this QMSR is in alignment with 1995 Act of Paperwork Reduction, and section 10 and 8 are more of an administrative purpose. Okay, so here it starts with QMSR, and this slide shows you how major sections are aligned with ISO 13485 requirements. Okay, so if you go to that final rule, you'll come across these 5 sections wherein you'll see there is more alignment of scope and definition, alignment of ISO 13485 and QMSR. So if you see section 820.1, it was basically about the scope of QMSR. Now this scope talks about the applicability of QMSR, wherein you get the various entities involved in getting the manufacturing licenses or the FDA approvals, such as manufacturers which are outside US, then repackagers, relabelers, labelers, Then there are remanufacturers, sterilization entities were there. So all these entities are in the scope of QMSR. There is no difference between QSR scope as well as QMSR scope. So the entities which needed to get FDA approval or FDA QMS clearance, they are still need to get approval from FDA. No one is exempted. That is what given in QMSR scope. Then it also talks about foreign manufacturers, what their requirements are. So if you are familiar with 21 CFR 820, the QMSR also speaks the same scope for foreign manufacturers. Okay, so different entities as I mentioned, designers or design and development entities, packaging entities, manufacturers, all these are under scope of QMSR. So this section, which was aligning with QSR, is also same for QMSR, but which is more aligned with ISO 13485. Okay, so ISO 13485 also has certain requirements for manufacturers. So if you have, if you are a manufacturer which fits the definition given by this scope, then in lining with that, you should also fulfill the requirement of ISO 13485. Then next section, which is alignment with ISO 13485, is section 820.3. Now this 820.3 talks about the definition. Now the definitions such as manufacturer, as I mentioned, component, customers, then process validation, product validation, verification. These were some of the definitions given in section 820.3. Some of the definitions were not part of ISO 13485. Those are kept as is, but wherein there are two same terms between this QMSR and ISO 13485, manufacturer should follow the definition which is given in QMSR. Okay, so if for example there is a definition in remanufacturer in ISO 13485 or ISO 9000, and same definition or same term is there in QMSR, the manufacturer should follow the terms, the definition which is given in QMSR, which is section 820.3. Then there are requirements in section 820.10. Now this section 825.10 talks about majorly QMS requirements. Okay. Now in ISO 13485, the QMS requirements are given from clause number 4 till clause number 8, which talks about management responsibility, then production capabilities, continuous monitoring. All these requirements are also given or in alignment with QMSR. But there are requirements such as medical device reporting, identification and traceability, as well as unique device identifier. These are some of the requirements which were already there in QSR. Those are taken as such in QMSR, but you should have SOPs, standard operating procedure, for following all these concepts. For example, UDI. Now, QMSR asks that all the medical devices which are approved and cleared by FDA should have their unique device identifier, which is there even if it is a single medical device or if it is in a kit or system, it should have unique device identifier. Now, what ISO 13485 tells is every medical device should be identified with unique identifier. So this alignment asks manufacturer to have identification SOP, standard operating procedure, from its conceptualization stage. Okay, so UDI also asks for the manufacturer to keep batch records for all the batches that are produced in their manufacturing facility. So if you have an SOP for UDI, your SOP for UDI should take care of all these aspects. Okay, so for example, UDI SOP will tell you that what if you have different configuration of your device. For example, if your device can go into system as well as it can go as a single device. Those two different configurations should have different UDIs so that it is traceable throughout its life cycle. So your UDI's SOP will specify that my configuration A will have UDI and my configuration B will have different UDI, and it will also have different batch records, and based on that UDI will be placed on the final packaging or the labels. Okay, so that is the example of UDI SOP, which is in alignment with ISO 13485 as well as QMSR. Similarly, there are requirements of medical device reporting. So if you are familiar with 21 CFR 803, it was talking about medical device reporting. So any medical device, whether it is class 1, class 2 or class 3, you should provide continuous monitoring report to FDA. If there are any recalls, if there are any complaints with respect to your devices in US FDA market, you should report those complaints to US FDA. That was the requirement from 21 CFR 820. Similarly, in ISO 13485, there is a section which asks manufacturer to continuous monitor their medical device after they go into market. Okay, so this SOP of continuous monitoring will include the fact that there are requirements for medical device reporting. So your SOP for continuous monitoring should have a clause which will state that if there are any adverse events or recalls with respect to my medical device, I will report those adverse events or complaint or recalls to US FDA, so that your already existing SOP will be in compliance with QMSR. Okay, so these are some of the practical implication of transitioning from QSR or transitioning from ISO 13485 to QMSR. So this was part of QMS requirement. Then comes part of section 820.35. It was with respect to record control. So this aspect of QMS requirement are also are alignment with record control, because you have to implement these SOPs and generate the record when you have certain recalls or adverse events. Okay, so record control, if you have any adverse events, you should keep the track of those adverse events through your documentation. This is one aspect. The other aspect would be investigation if there are any recalls. Okay. For example, your medical device has any complaint, and if you want to investigate that complaint for its root cause, and after doing the root cause, you come to the conclusion for certain design changes. Okay. And with respect to that, you also raise certain CAPA, corrective and preventive action. So in order to do that, you should have record of each of these activities. Say for example, this process, right, finding out complaint, you should have a procedure and record wherein that complaint was recorded. After that complaint was recorded, you will initiate the kappa, or you will initiate the root cause analysis first. So through record control, you will record what all root cause analysis was done. What was the team for root cause analysis? What was the technique of root cause analysis? How many members were involved? What was their qualification? This was recorded. When the root cause analysis is done, then what was the kappa that was initiated? What was the corrective action? So you will document or record that corrective action in place. Okay. Once that corrective action was recorded, you will implement that change in your design or in your QMS. So that should also be recorded. So section 820.35 talks about this record control, and it is also in alignment with ISO 13485. So what all activities you are conducting or executing, you should have record of those activities. So so 835 talks about that record control activities. Okay, so that was other aspect, and next aspect was to include confidentiality statement in all of the document that is generated and shared with regulatory bodies. It was not the requirement earlier, but if you are generating any documents, if you are writing any records, in header or footer, you should have this confidentiality statement that this information is confidential and it should not be reproduced or used in any other format. Okay, so whatever documents you are going to submit to US FDA, there should be a confidentiality statement in your documents. Okay, then the last part, which was the major alignment with ISO 13485, it was regarding section 820.40. So this 820.40, it talks about labeling and packaging. Now labeling and packaging, it was a requirement in QSR, but there was not specific mention that you should have SOP. Now also it doesn't specify, but the requirement is such that if you are following ISO 13485, you should have an SOP for labeling and packaging. Okay, so you should have certain details provided in your medical device file. So how the labeling and packaging SOP will look like? It will tell what will be the input for your labeling process. Say for example, once the device is manufactured, the manufacturing team or the production team will transfer this produced medical device to the labeling and packaging team. Okay, so labeling and packaging process will take care. It will have primary packaging, it will have secondary packaging and tertiary packaging. Once it goes through these packaging configurations, then the label will be introduced on those packaging. It will have different kinds of detail like UDI. What that UDI will include, this SOP will tell you that. Okay, so section 820.40 talks about that. Now you should have SOPs for labeling and packaging process, as well as this SOP should also have section wherein it will ask you to inspect the labeling and packaging information. Okay, since this labeling and packaging will be the first thing your users or the medical device patients or the patients will be interacting with, the information which is provided in labeling and packaging should be correct and should not be misguiding. Okay, that's why whatever information is going in labeling and packaging, it should be verified, it should be inspected, and this activity should be reflected in your SOP. So the SOP that I was mentioning about labeling and packaging, the second section of that SOP should be inspection of this labeling and packaging. So there should be a station or the person who is only inspecting or verifying the information which is provided in labeling and packaging. Okay, that's how you will be aligning alignment with QMSR, um, QMSR and ISO 13485. So what I mentioned is you should have reference of scope. If you are in scope of QSR, then you should follow the requirement of manufacturers. Then you should take a reference of definitions given in 820.3. If you see there are same terms, then present then this definition given in 820.3 will take precedence. Then there are requirement in 820.10 which are in alignment with ISO 13485. So you should draft the SOPs as per ISO 13485 for these requirements. Then you should control the records in alignment with ISO 13485 clause for record control and document control. And then you should have labeling and packaging information in place. Also SOP, and you should keep records of all these labeling and packaging information. Okay, so these were some of the major interference or major alignment points between QSR and ISO 13485, which became now QMSR. Okay, whatever I have mentioned, this section 820.1 scope talks about applicability, conflicts with other requirements such as QMSR, ISO 13485, ISO 9000. So that is given here. Then foreign manufacturers, entities, their responsibilities and their alignment with ISO 13485. What are the exemptions and variants in the scope, which is similar to QSR. Okay. Then 820.3 it talks about definition of component, customer, design validation, finished device, definition of non-conformity, process validation, remanufacturer, and rework. If you are versed with ISO 13485, most of these terms are very familiar to you. Okay, but in QSR there were different terms, different definition of these terms. So now the QSR tells that you should reflect or you should take reference of ISO 13485 and then take the consideration of these definitions. Then, as I mentioned, section 820.10, it talks about PMS requirement, about identification of device, traceability of device. Then, if there are adverse events or recalls with respect to your device, you should report it. Then, what are corrections and removals of your devices from the market. And last two sections are record control. This was repeated. It was Record control, as I mentioned, and labeling and packaging, which was discussed, right? The inspection of labeling and packaging, the SOP for it, and the record control for all the activities such as investigation, um, root cause analysis, and implementation of CAPA actions. Now, if you are in alignment with ISO 13485 and if you want to go for QMSR or QSR, what should be your implementation strategy? Some may say that we are in alignment with EN ISO 13485. Some may say that we are following ISO 13485 and they want to go for this QMSR. What should be the first step? Their first step should be gap analysis. They should assess the current quality management system against QMSR requirement. So the section which were explained earlier, this major section, they can focus on these sections first and try to see if there are any changes required or if there are any gaps in their SOP. Okay, so you should go through the SOPs that are drafted for your QMS and see if these sections are in alignment with your QMSR, and if there are any changes as per the requirement from FDA, you should make these changes. You should include some of the clauses. You should elaborate some of the SOP clauses in your quality management system. That is the first, the gap assessment is the first step. Okay. Then once you identify those gaps and draft the SOPs as per your QMS, then you have training programs. Your staff should be in alignment with new QMSR. So you can do training for QMSR. This awareness session which we are doing currently, these kind of sessions will help your staff to get acquaintances with the QMSR. Okay, so you will get your staff will get an idea, an overview of QMSR, and they will also understand how they should implement this QMSR into their daily activities. The SOP is one part. They will anyway go through their SOP trainings. However, if they attend some seminars or awareness sessions, they will get more information on how their work or activities are more correlated to the ultimate QMSR and how they should change their activities. Okay, so you should educate your staff on new regulatory requirements and quality management principle. Then once you do that, you should have documentation update. So if you are already complying with ISO 13485, your change control should take place in order to implement these changes with respect to QMSR. Okay, whatever SOPs updates are there, you should do those updates through your change control process, and ultimately you should do internal audit. Once you implement this QMSR, once you train your people, then to check the readiness of your organization with respect to QMR, you should do internal audit. Okay, it will ensure your compliance with QMSR, and also it will identify the improvement areas. So while doing internal audit, you may face certain areas where you need to work upon. For example, in MDR reporting, you may find that your MDR reporting SOP is non-compliant, or it is not covering all the aspect of MDR reporting. Then addition of clause may help, and through internal audit you can identify that. Okay, and finally, these are some of the key considerations if you want to. Yes, these are some of the key considerations while transitioning from ISO 13485 or QSR to QMSR. If you have ISO 13485 understanding, that is the benefit or an advantage a manufacturer will have if they want to transition into QMSR. They don't have to go for 21 CFR 820 now. There will not be redundancy in their documentation. There won't be additional work. It's just that whatever documentation they have, they do have to identify the improvement areas or the differences and bridge those gaps. Okay. The second pointer, FDA specific requirement, as I mentioned, the requirement for UDI, the requirement for MDR. These are some of the major requirements which are very FDA specific. So if you are complying with ISO 13485, you should include some of these requirements into your current SOP, and you will be able to comply with QMSR. Then risk-based thinking. I think majority of manufacturers nowadays are well aligned with risk-based approach. Still, if you are not in alignment with risk-based thinking of ISO 13485, you should identify the areas in your risk management, in your QMS, to identify the risks which are involved in production of your device, and then align that those SOPs with risk-based approach. Okay, so there should be verification, validation of each of the activities that is going to be carried out under your QMS, and the final output should be verified for the risk which is posed to the patient or the end user. Then documentation and records. ISO 13485 anyway tells the manufacturer to record all the activities which is under the scope of QMS, which is under the scope of the manufacturer's QMS. Okay, so QMS are also now tells about recording all the activities. So manufacturer should have a document. They should have records which will prove that whatever requirements are there, those are complied with. Then internal audits. This is the gate before you go for any FDA clearance or FDA approval. Your internal audit should be robust enough to identify key areas and also find out improvement areas for QMSR compliance. Okay, so you should have internal audits, internal auditors, which are very well versed with ISO 13485 as well as QMSR. They will identify these areas, suggest the remedial actions. Once you do that, then you are pretty sure that you are alignment with QMSR. Then you go for FDA approval or clearance. Okay, and if you start early, it's very easy to comply with QMSR. So you should take consideration of these timelines, and also should start initially or early so that you are ahead when you compare with other manufacturers. So if you take these key pointers to your QMS and work accordingly, I'm sure that you will be very you will be ahead in the race to get QMSR compliance and apply for FDA approvals or clearance. Okay, with that, I think I have provided information about this QMSR, and I hope it was very useful for you. Thank you for attending, everyone. Now, if you have any questions, we can take these questions. You can post this in group. Thank you so much for attending. Aishwarya, maybe we can take questions now.
Yes. So we'll take the questions from chat. Dr. Aarti has said, what are the additional requirements beyond ISO 13485, like UDI compliance required for QMSR?
Yes, UDI compliance is required for QMSR as well. As I mentioned in the sections also, you should have identification and traceability of your medical device in your QMS. So from the batch manufacturing record or the configuration, you should have different UDI for different configuration, different variations or variants, and you should have SOP which will dictate how this identification and traceability procedure will be carried out.
Yeah, thanks Akash for the insightful session. What I meant is, yes, apart from UDI, you already mentioned about MDR. Any
Yes.
other requirements beyond ISO 13485 for QMSR?
See, these are in alignment with ISO 13485.
Correct.
So if you are complying with ISO 13485, this section 820.30, it talks about identification and traceability. These are the major pointers, I would say.
Correct.
So you should have UDI tracking, traceability, then medical device reporting. Okay.
Correct.
Then corrections and removals. Now, in ISO 13485, you have continuous monitoring. And if you find out any complaints or any adverse events, there are provisions, and manufacturers can take a call based on the nature of complaint, whether to provide notice, advisory notice to the end user, or to recall the devices, right? So FDA also talks about that. This is corrections and removes. So these are major differences or additional sections you need to consider if you are already compliant with ISO 13485.
Okay. Thank you.
How is it different from MD SAP?
Okay, in MD SAP, it was asking for QSR, which is 21 CFR 820. The section where I have mentioned the differences between 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485, that was the major chunk. Now ISO 1, you have to comply or you have to be in alignment with ISO 13485, which is the risk-based approach. There are certain provisions in ISO 13485 for record control. There are provisions for UDI, identification and traceability. So you should take care of these sections explicitly, and also with respect to labeling and packaging, you should have SOP for those, okay, standard operating procedure, which was not mentioned in QSR 820 as per MD SAP. So if you don't have any SOPs for labeling and packaging, if you don't have SOP for medical device reporting, if you don't have SOP for identification and traceability, if you don't have SOP for um, recalls and corrective actions, then you should have these SOPs. Okay, that is the major difference. Then the definitions which were not provided in 21 CFR 820, and if you find some of the definitions which are explained in ISO 13485 or ISO 9001, you should take a reference if you want, if you are already in MD-SAP compliance. Okay. So
Next question is from Darshan. What are additional requirements required for labeling?
labeling requirements are UDI, and the UDI template is given with, by FDA. So UDI, what should it contains? Basically, UDI have two components. One is PI, production identifier, and second is DI, device identifier. Okay, so device identifier is nothing but the product name, the model name, and the device description. It will remain same mostly for most of your product if in a single assembly line, but production identifier will differ because the different devices will be produced in different batches at different time intervals. So production identifier is variable. So based on this production identifier, your device UDI will differ for different configuration as well as different variants. Okay, so UDI will have different various information apart from this identifier. It will have manufacturing date, it will have expiry date, it will also have if a picture of your device, then the storing conditions, handling conditions, transportation conditions based on your device packaging label. If your label is large enough, you can accommodate all this information. Otherwise, you can provide this information in your packaging. For example, IFU or package inserts, you should provide information in those package inserts. So what all things should be there in packaging and labeling, that is given by FDA, and whatever I have just mentioned, it's just a part of that information. Okay. For detailed information, you can contact us or you can also go through the guidance provided by FDA. But that was the major chunk based on UDA.
Dr. Nitika has asked, could you please elaborate on the process we need to follow when partnering with a manufacturing unit for our initial production?
Okay, now initial production also can mean two ways. Okay, if you are in the phase of design and development, the initial production can also be a pilot production, which is for testing purpose. And initial production also can mean once you get the approval from US FDA approval authority and you want to produce mass scale batches. Okay, so process is not given in US FDA guidance document or QMSR, or it is also not given in QMS ISO 13485. But in order to get partner with any production facility, you should have supplier quality agreement in place. Okay. Now this supplier quality agreement in place will ensure that what all activities will be performed by that contract manufacturer, and what is the responsibility of your organization as a legal manufacturer. So you should consider this factor and you should include what I will recommend is to have a section which enlists all the product life cycle phases. Okay, for example, concept stage, then design stage, after that, manufacturing stage, then labeling and packaging, storage, sales, and post market stage. Okay, so these are around 7 or 8 stages. Now, when you make supplier quality agreement with that production facility, you will check what all activities will be carried out by that supplier, okay, contract manufacturer, and based on those activities in other sections, you will write down my supplier will provide me the manufactured product as per the specification given by me. So as a manufacturer, you should have a design specification for your medical device. Your medical device specification will be provided to that contract manufacturer. That contract manufacturer will provide you the part as per that specification. You will inspect and you will sell that product into the market. Okay. Now these are the activities overall, but you should have SOPs, standard operating procedure, for carrying out all these activities. Okay. So QMS ISO 13485 or QMSR now will ask for those SOPs and the records if you are following all these activities or not. So if you are following what I'm saying, that is the answer to your question. Okay.
Can you provide guide on the QMS requirement for SAMD, MD as well?
SAMD. Okay, software as medical devices. Now, software as medical device itself has different or various guidelines given by FDA. Okay, software as medical device will not it will not follow standard QMS because it will not have hardware component. However, how you develop the software component, how you develop your algorithm, you should have the evidence of all the activities that is carried out in your software as medical device. Okay, so for example, how you capture the user requirement, so you should have URS document, right? Then how you transfer these user requirements into design input, you should have design input document. Okay, so SDS document will be there. Then how you are transferring your software design specification into final outputs, that document should be there. So when you transfer your design input to output, then you should verify your design. So software testing part comes in picture. So you should have plan for software testing, how you are completing your software testing, whether it's manual or automated, what platform you should have, or what platform you are using. Then the records of software testing should be there. Okay. Then before that, how you are developing your algorithm. Before developing the algorithm, what all architecture you have. So the components in your software, how they are interacting with each other, what is the interface between them, what is the input for each of those components. So all these aspects should be given. Um, I take an example of architecture diagram. Okay, so if your medical device is only software, you should have architecture diagram wherein you showcase all the aspects or all the components of your software, how they are interacting, what is the information flow, what is the feedback loop for different components or different modules in your software, and how it is robust, as in how you are ensuring the quality and safety of each of these components. That should be recorded through your QMS. And apart from that, there are guidelines for software as medical devices. If it contains the AI component, if it contains ML or machine learning components, what are document evidence you should produce, that is given in guidance document. Okay. For now, I mean, there are a lot of things you should provide to FDA. If you want to discuss it further, you can connect us after the session. We will take those questions. Okay. I mean, before we log off, I would request there will be a feedback form. Please provide your feedback. Aishwarya will share that feedback form with you. You can provide if you have any comments or improvement suggestions. Okay.
Yes, we have shared a feedback form link in the chat box. Kindly take few minutes to share your experience and let us know how RIFC can support you in your regulatory journey. Thank you all for joining and such engaging questions. And thank you, Akash, for your insightful talk. We hope that this session was insightful to all of you, understanding the requirements of QMSR. And thank you.
Yes, before closing, Aishwarya, I just have to inform that whatever questions were there other than whatever I have answered, we will take care of these questions. We will try to resolve those and try to connect after this call. Okay. So Aishwarya, please take these questions. We will take this after this session.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was nice interaction.